EVO. Glaciers don't forget. Snow falls, storms pass, seasons turn, tourists come and go. But high above the valleys, ice moves with a patience that outlasts human memory. What disappears on a glacier doesn't vanish. It waits. In August of 1989, a young Canadian man stepped onto a glacier in the Austrian Alps. He rented equipment, rode the lifts, and disappeared into a place designed for recreation. A ski resort where safety was assumed, where the terrain was managed, where people were supposed to come back down. He didn't. For 14 years, the mountain said nothing. And when it finally did give him back, it didn't give answers. It gave questions. Questions about broken equipment, questions about injuries, questions about what might have happened after he was already in trouble. Questions about whether the mountain buried him or whether someone else helped. Tonight, we step onto that glacier with a man named Duncan MacPherson and into a story where ice preserved a body, but time may have erased the truth. This episode comes at the request of a longtime listener named Jeanette Mead. Jeanette, thank you very much for bringing this to my attention. In a little while, we'll reach the moment where investigators begin asking a chilling question. If Duncan vanished on the mountain, how did his equipment possibly make its way back? Edgar Allan Poe once wrote that the boundaries which divide life from death are, at best, shadowy and vague. On a glacier, that line is more than just shadowy. It's also frozen. If you're drawn to stories where landscape, mystery, and the human condition collide, follow The Devil Within and share this episode with someone who loves the kind of mystery that lingers long after the facts end. Welcome back to The Devil Within. Tonight's story takes us to the Austrian Alps in the late summer of 1989, to a glacier resort, a young athlete at a crossroads in life, and a disappearance that would remain locked in ice for 14 years. You're listening to Frozen Evidence. This is Chapter 1, The Last Ride. Duncan MacPherson wasn't a man trying to disappear. At 27 years old, he was standing in the uncertain middle of a life that had once seemed entirely mapped out. A first-round NHL draft pick in his youth, MacPherson had built his identity around hockey. The rink lights, the structure of the season, the physical rhythm of training and competition. But injuries had interrupted that trajectory, and like many athletes at the edge of transition, he found himself in a strange emotional landscape. No longer where he had been, and not yet sure where he was going. That summer, Europe afforded possibility. Coaching, maybe playing overseas, travel before commitment. It wasn't escape, it was a recalibration. By August 1989, Duncan had made his way into Austria and up toward the Stubai Valley, where the Stubai Glacier resort sat high above green valleys that looked impossibly soft from the snowline. But even in summer, the glacier held winter. But even in summer, the glacier seemed to hold winter. Lifts carried skiers and snowboarders upward into bright white terrain, while hikers wandered lower slopes among rock and grass. It was the kind of place where people went to feel alive. And the resort environment mattered. This wasn't backcountry wilderness where travelers vanished without a trace. Stubai was organized, managed, commercial. Equipment was rented, lift tickets were scanned, staff worked predictable routes, grooming snow, and maintaining terrain. It all felt safe, the way places built for recreation are supposed to feel safe. So Duncan rented a snowboard, and that detail, as small as it sounds, would become one of the quiet anchors of the mystery. Rental gear is logged, tagged, and assigned. Boards and boots move through a system of hands, counters, and paperwork. This wasn't a man strapping on his own gear and slipping into unmarked terrain. He entered the mountain through the front door. Witnesses remember him on the lifts that day, tall and athletic, otherwise unremarkable in the way that most people are when they don't yet know they're standing on the edge of their last afternoon. He rode up into the glacier's wide slopes, where summer snow softened under the sun, and visibility could change quickly as clouds drifted across high ridges. At some point, he just stopped being seen. There was no dramatic moment, there was no shout of alarm, no lift operator signaling distress. The day ended. Chairs kept turning. Other riders came down the mountain carrying stories of good snow and bright air. But Duncan didn't come back with them. At first, absence didn't equal emergency. Solo travelers create gaps in expectation. Maybe he stayed overnight somewhere. Maybe he met someone. Maybe he changed plans. Days passed before concern hardened into fear. His car was still in the resort parking lot. Inside were belongings you don't leave behind if you intend to start a new life. Travel items, personal effects, quiet evidence that he meant to return. Search efforts began under an assumption that felt tragically ordinary in the Alps. A tourist had wandered into dangerous terrain. Maybe he'd gone hiking off marked areas. Maybe he'd fallen into a crevasse or slipped on ice where no one saw. The mountains held countless such stories. Helicopters scanned, teams walked sections of glacier and surrounding areas. But glaciers are deceptive. Their surfaces look smooth from afar and fractured up close. Snow bridges hide voids. Meltwater reshapes features daily. A body can disappear beneath shifting layers of ice and snow within hours, sealed into motion. But nothing was found. And then time did what it does in high places. Autumn came, more snow fell, wind erased tracks, winter storms layered new snow over old. The glacier, which never really stops moving, carried everything on its surface slowly downhill, compressing, preserving, and concealing. For Duncan's family, the years became an ache without edges. No body meant no finality. No sight of death meant no place to stand and say goodbye. Hope flickered long past reason because uncertainty has a way of feeding possibility. Maybe he survived. Maybe he lost his memory. Maybe there was a mistake in the search. But glaciers just don't answer quickly. They keep their own calendar. And for 14 years, the mountain kept Duncan MacPherson. Chapter 2. What the ice gave back. 14 years is a long time for the world to move on. Careers change, families get older. The sharp edge of grief softens into something duller but never really gone. For the MacPherson family, Duncan's disappearance settled into that terrible category of loss without proof. A question mark that stretched across birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days when memory arrives uninvited. And then, in July of 2003, the glacier began to melt in a way that exposed more than rock. A resort worker on the glacier noticed something dark in the ice. At first it could have been debris, a glove maybe, or part of old equipment frozen into the surface. But as meltwater carved channels through the snow and ice, the shape resolved into something unmistakably human. The mountain hadn't forgotten. Recovery teams approached carefully. Glacial ice is both preserver and destroyer, locking objects in place while grinding them slowly through time. When they began the delicate work of freeing the remains, they found clothing, personal items, and eventually confirmation of what the MacPherson family had lived with for almost 15 years. Duncan had never left that mountain. He'd been there the whole time, carried downhill inch by inch inside the glacier's slow, silent machinery. But what the ice gave back wasn't a simple story of a fall and a frozen burial. Among the items recovered was his snowboard, and the condition of that board unsettled people who would later study the case. It wasn't just scuffed or snapped from a single high-speed crash into ice or rock. It showed crushing damage, compression that looked less like a rider's impact and more like the force of something heavy moving over it. In alpine ski areas, especially on glaciers, heavy machines operate after the lifts close. Snowcats, large tracked grooming vehicles. They crawl across the slopes at night, reshaping snow, smoothing out surfaces, and maintaining runs for the next day. They're powerful, deliberate, and in low visibility, they're not omniscient. If someone was already injured or unconscious or partially buried, a driver would never know they'd passed over a person or his equipment. Now, this possibility was never declared as an official cause, but it did enter the conversation. Some who examined the board and read forensic summaries suggested the pattern of damage was consistent with a snowcat passing over it. Now, it was, again, not a definitive conclusion, but it was a scenario that fit the physical evidence as well as, or perhaps better than, just a simple fall. Then there were the injuries. Accounts of Duncan's remains describe trauma that, to some analysts, did not align cleanly with a single fall on open terrain. Instead, they hinted at multiple forces, compression rather than just impact. Again, nothing conclusive, but enough to raise a question that lingered like a low note under the whole case. What if he had fallen or become injured first, and something happened afterward? But then came the detail that chilled people the most. Over the years, as family members and independent investigators dug into the timeline, claims surfaced that Duncan's rented equipment may have been returned to the resort shop after his disappearance. Yeah, returned. Now, this was never documented in a way that erased doubt, but the suggestion alone carried weight. Rental shops track gear. Items go missing, yes, but they also come back through human hands. Staff or other guests or recovery teams. If his board and boots were back in the system before his body emerged from the glacier, it implied a gap in the narrative. Because equipment doesn't walk down a mountain and return itself, on its own. Sure, maybe another skier found it and turned it in unaware of the larger context. Maybe resort staff collected abandoned gear during routine operations. Maybe records were incomplete. Or memories were distorted by time. All very possible. But emotionally, the idea lands in a darker place. It suggests that somewhere between Duncan's last known moments and the glacier's long silence, other people were close enough to touch what he had used that day. Close enough to unknowingly move pieces of the story without realizing what they were a part of. Or close enough to realize and just choose not to ask questions. So no one has proven intent. No document declares a deliberate act of concealment. But as questions about snowcat operations, search procedures, and equipment records piled up, some began to wonder whether what followed Duncan's disappearance was less a grand conspiracy and more a human instinct. Protect the institution, avoid liability, assume the mountain took him, and just leave it at that. In that version of events, a tragedy becomes a quiet cover-up not because anyone planned it, but because acknowledging uncertainty carries risk. The glacier preserved Duncan's body, but it may also have preserved a silence that formed in the days after he vanished. A silence that hardened like ice and lasted just as long. When the MacPherson family finally had his remains returned, they also inherited this shadowed possibility that the mountain didn't act alone. And that somewhere, in the hum of engines on summer snow, the truth might have been driven over and smoothed away. Chapter 3. The Silence Beneath the Snow. When a body comes home, people expect an ending. They expect the weight of uncertainty to lift, for grief to settle into a shape that they can finally hold. A burial, a marker, a place to stand and say, this is where the story closes. But some discoveries don't close stories. They fracture them into new questions. For the MacPherson family, the glacier's release of Duncan's remains brought a measure of relief that had been unimaginable during the long years of just not knowing. He had not chosen to vanish. He had not started a new life under another name. The mountain had kept him. But what the ice revealed also forced them to look at a possibility more complicated than a simple accident. Because if a fall alone didn't explain everything, if the damage to his board, the nature of his injuries, and the whispers about equipment returning, if they were all pieces of a different puzzle, then Duncan's death might not have belonged entirely to the landscape. It might have belonged, at least in part, to the systems humans built on that landscape. Ski resorts are places of joy and risk managed into recreation. But they're also businesses with reputations, with liability concerns, and hierarchies of decision-making. When accidents happen, and they do, there are procedures, reports, and internal reviews. Most of the time, those processes exist to improve safety, to learn, and to prevent repetition. But sometimes, especially decades ago in less regulated environments, the instinct to protect the institution could blur with the instinct to protect people. If Duncan fell and lay injured on the glacier, and if a snowcat later passed through that area without seeing him, the tragedy would have been immediate and irreversible. A driver obviously might not have known, probably wouldn't have. Supervisors might not have known. But once questions arose about missing guests or equipment, about unexplained damage, someone, somewhere, probably realized the implications. And then the choice would not have been between right and wrong in a simple sense. It would have been between exposure and silence, between admitting uncertainty and accepting legal, financial, and reputational consequences, or assuming the mountain had already taken the blame. This is how quiet cover-ups often form, not as evil plans, but as a series of small decisions made in rooms where fear outweighs clarity. No official document confirms such a chain of events in the Duncan MacPherson case, just for the record. No court ruling declared any wrongdoing. The record, though, does remain inconclusive, suspended in the same uneasy space where glaciers suspend bodies. But the absence of certainty isn't the absence of possibility. And for families living with loss, possibility can be its own private burden. Because nature is easier to forgive than people. When an avalanche kills, we grieve, but we accept the randomness of the world. When a storm takes a life, we call it tragic, but impersonal. The mountain is vast, indifferent, and incapable of intention. But if human systems might have played a role, even through oversight, even through fear, even through a desire to avoid scrutiny, then the grief changes, gains an edge. It asks different questions. Man, did someone know? Did someone decide not to look too closely? Did the glacier keep a secret that began with human hands? Today, the Stubai Glacier still welcomes visitors. Snowcats still crawl across slopes at night, reshaping the snow for the morning crowd. The lifts hum. Laughter carries across white expanses under blue summer skies. Nothing in the air tells newcomers that beneath the ice, time once held a young man for 14 years. Nothing marks the exact place where he last stood, last balanced on his board, last looked across the vastness and felt alive. But the glacier remembers. It remembers the weight of a body carried slowly downhill in frozen darkness. It remembers the compression of years, the grinding of ice, the long patience before meltwater thinned the surface enough to give him back. And in that memory, the line between accident and aftermath remains blurred. Remember, Edgar Allan Poe, one of the greats, he wrote that the boundaries between life and death are shadowy and vague. And on the glacier, this time they were also frozen. And maybe, somewhere in that quiet between falling snow and moving machines, another boundary froze too. The line between what the mountain did and what people chose not to see. Glaciers don't rush. They don't answer to urgency or grief or the human need for neat conclusions. They move on their own schedule, carrying whatever they take with them, memories, evidence, questions, just locked in cold, suspended animation. When Duncan MacPherson stepped onto that glacier in 1989, no one could have imagined it would take 14 years for the mountain to return him. And when it did, sure, the ice gave back a body, but far from a clear story. Maybe he fell, alone and unseen, swallowed by terrain that has claimed countless lives before and since. Or maybe, somewhere between the fall and the freezing, human systems intersected with tragedy. Not with malice, but with fear, with uncertainty, and the quiet instinct to let the mountain take the blame. We'll probably never know, but the glacier reminds us of something unsettling and deeply human, that truth, like ice, can move slowly, can surface unexpectedly, and yet still arrive incomplete. Sometimes the devil isn't in what we know. Sometimes it's in what we leave buried. Next time on The Devil Within, we step out of the mountains and into a house where the fear didn't come from nature. It came from inside the walls. A place where people said something unseen moved through rooms at night, and where the explanation might be more human and more disturbing than anyone ever wanted to admit. We'll see you next time on The Devil Within. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.